would like to welcome you, Tania.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here for Earth Month. At Bio for Climate, Earth Month is every month, but we'll celebrate it extra this month. So yeah, I'll just share my screen, get right into it. So yes, my name is Tania Roa. I work for Biodiversity, Livable Climate, and that is my course, Ego versus Echo, How Human, Animal, and Planet Health Interconnect. And I'll just discuss why I picked this title. It was basically off of this graphic, these two philosophies, ego and echo. As you can see on the left, we have ego in red, and then on the right, we have echo in green. And so the idea is to compare these two mindsets. And ego, that's more the dominant system we have today. We have this idea that humans are above other species. And so we have this pyramid, this hierarchy, whereas in echo that we believe is the right way to live. We believe that humans should be alongside every other species, that no species is more important than another. And that way we live more in harmony with all of the other species on this planet. So as you can see on the left, we have this human in red at the very top. And then on the right, you have this in green, this human. And I like to point out to people, because the echo is a circle, even though the human looks more on the bottom, there is no bottom because it's circle, right? So that's the idea, that we all are just in harmony, and even men and women, all different people, we also don't have a hierarchy within humanity as well. So that's what we've been discussing throughout the course. And there are two new philosophies that governments and institutions have started to look into to kind of adopt this echo model. We have one health and one welfare. So I'll just get into these philosophies that are pretty dominant in worldwide, either in animal welfare organizations, or like I'll talk about the CDC as well, which if I'm sure you've all heard this past year or so, the CDC has been really famous for just its idea of trying to prevent disease. And so we'll talk about how they're adopting these philosophies to do that. So One Health is really this approach that recognizes that the health of people, of us, is closely connected to the health of other species and in the places that we live in our environment. Whereas One Welfare really focuses on how animal welfare is connected to human well-being and physical and social environment. So I'll just compare and contrast these two philosophies, and then we'll discuss how these are being used to prevent zoonotic diseases. And I'll explain what zoonotic diseases are in just a bit. So One Health, we really see this Venn diagram, this idea that human health, environmental health, and animal health all come together to one, that we all are healthy if the other parts of this Venn diagram are healthy as well. Whereas if one part of this Venn diagram isn't healthy, then it impacts the health of the other parts of this Venn diagram. And One Health is really human focused because the idea is to focus on public health and how to improve public health by preventing diseases. So although we have this idea that all healths are interconnected in this model, we really are trying to look at this model to prevent further human illnesses, death, things like this. Whereas, and we'll get into it, One Welfare focuses more on animal health. And so the causes for disease spread in this model are close contact. As we know with COVID, not always the best idea. And human development is one reason as well, just because we come into closer contact with animals that we haven't had contact with before, or with environments as well, such as if we take down some trees and enter the forest that we've never been in before, as at least not in close contact as often, then that can lead to diseases as well. In Massachusetts, I'm sure you've all heard of Lyme disease. That's kind of one reason when you go out in the woods, you have to be careful of that. And also just the global trade, because we are bringing germs from other places rapidly, more so than we have done ever before. And so that leads to a lot of diseases as well. So that's One Health, really preventing those three causes, whereas One Welfare, like I said, focuses on animal welfare. And so it looks at these 5 different pillars. And just so you all know, you will, if you want these slides, can have them. So you don't have to try to read all these different graphs. I know they can have small writing. I'll just give you a summary of this though. these are the 5 components of the One Welfare philosophy. And there's also a whole website on this philosophy and how they're adopting it in other places in the world. And the idea is to enhance our encounters, our interventions with animals, such as therapy dogs, such as pets, things like this, even farm animal welfare, places where we are constantly in contact with other species, and how to improve those and how to make sure that we don't get sick while we are with those other species. And so it's just addressing these relationships and making sure that both parties are healthy, that the animals have the space that they need, the shelter, the food and water, the things they need to really not only be healthy physically, but also socially, that they are in contact with other animals of their species if they like that. Of course, some species are solitary and don't need that. And for us as well, that we make sure that we are comfortable with other animals in our presence. And One Welfare emphasizes that although it focuses on animal welfare, it tries to go into other parts of our health and well-being. And they really don't use the word health, actually, like One Health. One Health uses the word health because, like I said, it focuses on physical health, whereas One Welfare is trying to go a step beyond that. It's saying also social and mental well-being is very important. And so that's why we see here in the middle, human well-being under this umbrella. And we see things like crime reduction, like separation anxiety, food safety, things that you wouldn't really maybe think that are connected to animal welfare, but that's what they emphasize in this philosophy, that everything is connected to all of our health and well-being. And environmental conservation as well. We have sustainability, we have livestock, farmer well-being, just to name a few, and productivity. So how do we do all these things in society? How do we make sure we have the resources that we need as humans while making sure that other species have the resources they need? How do we find that balance? And that is the idea of One Welfare, to make sure that we find a way that everyone is able to really reach the autonomy and the quality of life that they deserve. And the outcomes of this philosophy, like I said, kind of go into a lot of parts of society. So we have overall well-being, just because when we are focusing on all the parts of our well-being, environmental and animal and ours, then we can actually achieve that overall well-being. And this also addresses social problems such as poverty and local community support, because we make sure, like I said, that everyone has the resources they need. And so we make sure to just uplift every community. And also to make sure that these industries where we do involve animals, such as farming, of course, we need farming for food, for all these things. So we have to make sure that these systems in place, the food systems in place, things like that, are actually sustainable, that they can actually last a long time, since we'll always need food. So we need to make sure that it actually lasts. And that's just the idea of One Welfare, that when we actually address the causes of not only disease, but also the lack of social and mental well-being, then we will be able to make these things sustainable. So these two philosophies, I picked them just because, like I said, they are being more adopted worldwide, organizations, institutions, governments even. And so I wanted to compare and contrast them just to see if, and we could talk about it in our first question session, if we actually feel that these philosophies are becoming better for humanity, are actually addressing the issues that we need to address. So there are some similarities. They both do include human, animal, and environmental health, as we all can tell, and they do advocate for a different approach than what we're doing now. They do try to advocate for that echo approach, that approach of us being in that circle, whereas in that approach that we have a lot of the times now, where we're on top, the humans are on top in that hierarchy. But there are some differences, of course. And so One Health doesn't really discuss biodiversity. It really focuses on how our environment, the human environment is, whereas essentially if humans aren't there, then we don't need to discuss it as much. And One Welfare doesn't discuss that. One Welfare actually does explicitly say the word biodiversity. And One Health, like I said, focuses on prevention, whereas One Welfare focuses on enhancing. It's not only focusing on the bad per se, it's focusing on the good. What can we improve on? What can we develop? and how can these relationships really be improved between humans and other species. And One Health does, because it's adopted by institutions like the CDC, who are focused on public health, who are focused on human health, it is intended to improve human health, whereas One Welfare is intended to improve human and animal. Although they both discuss environmental well-being, it really doesn't explicitly say how the environment is better off with these philosophies. So that's why I didn't include that. It doesn't really discuss how we can improve environmental well-being in either of these. So with that said, we'll discuss how these are being used to prevent zoonotic diseases, and I'll just go ahead and explain that now. Zoonotic diseases are caused by viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungi, really the things that cause any other disease. And so they're caused by a variety of things. And like other diseases as well that aren't zoonotic, they range from mild to fatal, the symptoms range. And so they aren't always necessarily as harmful as other diseases. And zoonotic, to clarify, just means that the disease can jump hosts. So here we see a pig. If a pig is sick and then the farmer gets sick, that's a zoonotic disease because that bacteria, that virus, that parasite, that fungi somehow was able to mutate or able to find a different host, and that host would be us, humans. And so that's what zoonotic means, that it jumps from one species to another. And the tricky thing about zoonotic diseases is that in that scenario, the pig may not even seem infected. And so the farmer gets sick and may not even know where that disease came from, which of course can lead to a lot of problems, because then how do you treat a pig if you don't know if he's sick? And how do you know to isolate that pig from all the other pigs in the farm if you don't know which one's sick? So that can easily become more of an issue if more pigs, more farmers, and then more people and people from other towns start to get sick. We saw it with COVID, we see it with a lot of diseases, they just tend to spread and spread and spread unless we know where to find that cause or that root cause, then we can address it. And so zoonotic diseases are more than half of the known infectious diseases. And there are a lot of diseases that we don't know of yet, but we think that zoonotic diseases are more than 50% of emerging ones as well. So just ones that are in places that humans necessarily haven't contacted with, such as the Arctic, places like this where it's really isolated that we don't spend a lot of time in. That's where they think these diseases are coming from. So how do these diseases spread? Really like any other disease. We have direct contact, as we see here. This kid is touching this sheep, and so there's direct contact there. There's indirect contact as well. Like I have a dog. If any of you have a pet, indirect contact would be me going to sit where my dog has sat. He's allowed on the couch. So if he goes on the couch and then I go there and he was sick, that would be like an indirect contact scenario. There's also vector-borne. The most famous would be such as mosquitoes. And then there's foodborne. If you've heard of salmonella, just if your meat is not cooked right, something like that. And then there's waterborne, which can happen if water is contaminated, and that can be contaminated by animal feces or something like that. That can happen in a farm setting, but then it spreads. So the first example of zoonotic diseases I have is West Nile virus, like I mentioned, the mosquito. And I made sure to put a picture of a mosquito not biting someone. I wanted to put a picture of a mosquito pollinating, because a lot of people don't know, and I did not know this actually until recently, that mosquitoes are pollinators. So I just want to emphasize that, because one solution, quote unquote, for diseases like this, where it's vector-borne, the first idea may be, oh, why don't we just get rid of mosquitoes, right? Why don't we just get rid of that species that's transferring that disease? But if we do that, if we get rid of mosquitoes, we get rid of pollination, and we do need pollination for crops, for food sources, for human food sources. So that is why I chose this picture, to just remind everyone that mosquitoes are important to the ecosystem, and solutions may not be as simple as just getting rid of one species. And So the reason that West Nile virus exists in humans is a mosquito will actually first bite an infected bird and then bite another animal, which would be us in a lot of cases. And the interesting thing about this is I feel that with this disease, if you have heard of it, West Nile virus, you may have heard of just a mosquito, right? Be careful of mosquitoes, they're dangerous because they transfer this. And while that is true, we need to protect ourselves. It's interesting to me to know that they actually first bite an infected bird. They actually don't even carry the disease on their own. So it's just interesting to see how things in ecosystems, things in the environment all correlate, all have this cycle that, again, just getting rid of one part of that cycle, just getting rid of one species won't actually lead to a solution, because in this case, the patient zero, if you will, is actually a different animal. It's a bird. And West Nile virus, although people can pass away and sadly do get really sick from this, a lot of people don't. More often than not, it's usually just mild symptoms. You may not even actually know that you have this disease per se, because it could just feel like a fever, something else that you may have come down with. And like I said, it is just important to protect ourselves. So that's where we have insect repellent, lightweight, long sleeve shirts and long pants. If it's, hot, that's why I say lightweight, so they're not all hot also when it's sunny outside. So that's our first example of a vector-borne zoonotic disease. Oh, sorry about that. And then our second example is of a bacteria. So bacterial infection, we see this scared cow because the brucellosis, this infection, comes through dairy products, and it can spread through the air or direct contact. And so it can be you drinking milk or just something that gets passed on through. Once the milk comes out of the cow, it comes out into the air. It could be just from breathing that in as well. And this zoonotic disease is a bit interesting because at first you kind of just feel lethargic. You may just feel, oh, fatigue, joint pain, sweats and chills. I'm not sure what I have. That's very strange. And then you feel like you get better. You think, oh, okay, whatever that was, it's gone now. But actually, because this is a bacterial infection, it won't go away unless we have antibiotics. And I'll talk about antibiotics in a bit as well. And then what happens with this disease is symptoms may come back later, months from then. So from then you think, well, it couldn't be that thing that I had months ago. I got better already. So it's a bit scary, but it is curable because, like I said, it could just be treated with antibiotics. So it doesn't happen often that it leads to that point with the symptoms coming back, as long as it's treated, of course. So speaking of antibiotics, although antibiotics are great, they're a great medical invention. I myself have used them a lot of times already in my short life. So I'm super thankful for antibiotics. It's the reason I am here today, I think. And with that said, we do have a lot of overuse of antibiotics, and we see that a lot in places like this, in places where there are just animals stashed into one area close together. And I mean, animals like us are not supposed to live in places like this, in close quarters, where they are walking around in their own feces, where they don't have sunlight, where they are often being fed food that isn't really great for them as well. And so the places where we do this, the idea is that these animals get fat, they get ready for market, they get ready to become meat really fast. And so it is helpful in that sense because productivity and efficiency is high, but the downside is they get sick often. And like we've all talked about with One Health and One Welfare, if animals get sick, we tend to get sick. And so to prevent them from getting sick, we are just feeding them antibiotics, not even if they are sick, but only because to prevent something. And that is leading to antibiotic resistance, where when we use too many of these, we see them in waterways, we see them in our food, and then we eat them. So even if you've not been prescribed antibiotic, you may be just getting lingering elements of it because it's in your food, because it was once fed to a chicken or a cow or something. And so when it does become resistant, that just means that the bacteria is getting so used to this medicine, it's becoming stronger. And that means that the bacteria is going to be harder to treat if it's already resistant to the medicine that we had in place for them. So this is just something to keep in mind when we talk about antibiotics. The medical industry is aware of this. They are trying to prescribe less to humans, and they're, well, of course, if you need it, then you should have it, but they're just trying to make sure that they can first see if there are other treatments that they can prescribe before. And farmers are aware of this as well. So really the biggest solution is to make sure that these animals are living the lives that they're supposed to live in the first place, which is outside in the sunlight, grazing grass or insects, whatever these animals tend to eat. So with all that said, I will say one last story that has a lot of factors and showing how these just ecosystem cycles work into place and all these processes are, how they all kind of come together. So this is the story of the white-footed mice, and this here is a white-footed mice, very cute and tiny. So the white-footed mice actually carries black-legged ticks. And if I know you guys are all in Massachusetts, so you probably heard a lot of ticks and are tired of hearing about ticks. So yes, ticks can lead to Lyme disease if they bite you and if they have that disease. And ticks are actually carried around on white-footed mice. And so these mice are just notorious for having these ticks on them. And you can say that they're hosting the ticks, if you will. And white-footed mice love acorns. And so going back more than a century ago, we had all over North America, all over the US, I believe Canada as well, all over North America, we had passenger pigeons who also loved acorns. And the reason I'm going back so far in time is because when the passenger pigeon went extinct due to hunting, due to habitat loss, just when we started developing, the Industrial Revolution came into play. That's when we lost passenger pigeons across North America when they were once really abundant. And so when that happened, white-footed mice were happy. They were like, oh, we don't have competition for our acorns, more acorns for us. So they started eating more, they started reproducing more because they were just having a ball without competition. And with that, we created a void in the ecosystem that is still being felt today because there are just so many more white-footed mice today than there once was. And that means there are more ticks than there once was, since these ticks are living on these little mice. And the last part of that story is, well, what are the predators? I mean, why can't we just, make sure that these white-footed mice are getting eaten? Well, the biggest predator of the white-footed mice are foxes. And foxes are very shy. They're not like coyotes that are really adapted to urban areas. Coyotes, as you all have them over there, I have them here as well. They kind of have just adapted to this man-made, concrete jungle that we've created, whereas foxes do not like that as much. And so because of that, white-footed mice are able to go into areas, urban areas, homes, attics, things like this, office buildings where foxes do not want to go. And so that's just another reason why we have more white-footed mice than we would have if we had more predators, if we had more space for the predators, and if we had the passenger pigeons. And so I know this can seem like a terrible story, but just remember that through all of this, we will get to a part at the very end where we talk about solutions. So just keep that in mind. And so the root causes of all zoonotic diseases are really just the way that we humans interact with our planet, with our environment, with other species, and zoonotic diseases are a result of that, one of the results of that. And so just humans, more of us means more cities, more back to that concrete jungle, so more development. And because of that, we're going into places that we never were. I actually here am living pretty close to the mountains. And so that can be one indication of that before we didn't used to live in areas like this, really close to the mountains, and now we do. So all these animals that live there do wander around here, and I do get to encounter them. And those encounters can be detrimental to me if they're sick, and then I get sick. We also have just more domesticated animals, like that picture of the chickens where there are so many of them. And not only are there so many, but because we're raising them for food, we have to interact with them on the daily. So that can also be a cause of zoonotic diseases. And the animals themselves aren't necessarily the problem in any of these scenarios, really. It's more of just how we interact with them. So especially with farming methods, like I said, because we have them all just stashed into this one area, whereas if we had them in the sunlight, if they were living healthy lives, just like us. When we are healthy, when we have what we need, we are less likely to get sick. And so because of that, because of the farming methods that we have, the industrial meat system, industrial food system, that is why we're leading to more animals that are getting sick. And also just damaged ecosystems. When we develop, we cut down trees, we pollute waterways, things like that, that could just lead to more people getting sick in general. And that can also lead to more zoonotic diseases. So before we get into wildlife-human conflict, Megan, let me know, should I stop sharing my screen while we do questions, or what would you prefer?
Why don't you keep your screen up just for now, and we can see, I know 1 or 2 people have typed in the chat box. And then also feel free to unmute yourself or put your camera on, whichever you're more comfortable with, to ask any question you have. I know I have one for you, but let me read one from the chat box first. This is from Janet. She asked, what did you say was harmed by mosquito spray?
What is harmed, like humans?
You must have said something was harmed by mosquito spray. Maybe she didn't catch it. Do I have that right, Janet King?
Yeah, I asked it and I got the answer in the chat books. Thank you. It said, I just couldn't hear the word she said, because there was some interfering noise at the same time she said the word. So bees and other pollinators is something which I would have imagined too, but I just wanted to catch the word that she had said. So it all got settled. Thank you.
Oh, okay, sorry you didn't hear that. Yeah, so just to clarify, mosquitoes are pollinators and like bees, of course. So the idea is to protect yourself with insect repellent. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, so we shouldn't use pesticides in our gardens. I just want to say that bulletin when I get a chance to. Some of my neighbors have pesticide signs up. So, I know they're using them, and that's bad for the bees because I pollinate a garden and I'm trying to keep away from pesticides.
Great point. Yes, I totally agree.
Okay.
Anybody else have a question? Tania, if I may ask, and forgive me because maybe I just kind of missed it at the beginning, but you were referring to the One Health and the One Welfare. And I may have missed it when you started speaking about it, but those are just general terms that you are using, or is it something very specific, like an organization called One Health and another one called One Welfare? Can you explain that?
Yeah, good question. So I could also send you links to these websites. One Health is really championed by the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. And I know it's in the US, but I believe international governments as well, because that is part of our federal government. I believe they're adopting them as well. It's more of an idea that a lot of institutions are just adopting, or a model, if you will. And because the idea is to bring all these sectors together. So farming, they also bring zoologists together under circumstances then they wouldn't really be together if it wasn't for One Health. And so to make sure, okay, how do we use your expertise to prevent diseases in humans? So that's One Health. It's more of a model that institutions are adopting. But there is a website on the CDC that really breaks it down that I can send you. And One Welfare has its own website. It has its own booklet. It is more of a, I guess it is more specific, as you were saying. And this, from what I've seen, is mostly adopted by animal welfare organizations. So although One Welfare is almost its own organization, I don't know if it's actually established, but they have their own website and everything. It is also a model that a lot of organizations adopt.
I see. Thank you. And also you'll as we go further into your presentation here, you'll talk about what people can do to perhaps prevent some of these things that you're talking about now.
Yes, yeah. So that's I know. I tell this to my students as well in my class, because I feel like at first it's almost depressing or really sad to see all these stories, but we are going to talk about solutions.
Great. Okay.
Any other questions, or should we move on?
I think we can move on.
All righty. So our next section is wildlife-human conflict. And what is wildlife-human conflict? Well, there are different definitions, but the ones that I felt were the best to exemplify were one by World Wildlife Fund. That's the panda logo, if you've seen that. When struggles arise from people and animals coming into contact. Very basic, just us when, you see a bear, you see even a bee, and you don't want to get stung, things like that. So what happens when we actually come into contact with other species? And if that leads to a negative encounter, it's a conflict. But my personal favorite definition is negative interactions between us and wild animals that have consequences for both. Because I do feel like, even though it's wildlife-human conflict, we tend to emphasize how it's conflict for humans rather than how it can also be detrimental to other animals. For example, if the bee did sting me, well, we know that when bees sting, they die. So obviously that's not great for the bee as well. Or if I did come in contact with a bear, although that's very scary for me, I'm sure the bear is just as scared as well. So just to keep that in mind, that when we're really looking at this eco-world view where we're all the species in one circle, things like this aren't necessarily only detrimental to humans, but also to other species as well. So what are causes of conflict and why does it even happen in the first place? Land use, I know we've kind of already talked about that and we'll keep talking about it just because it does lead to a lot of detrimental things, but like I said, we will get to solutions on land use. So here you see a road, just the way that we cut through roads and the way that animals also use them because they see, oh, what a great way to get from place A to place B. It's easy for me as well. So just the way that we use land and the way that animals also use it. Then also climate, just the changes in climate. We have animals that are starting to move or migrate because they are not finding the conditions they need in the places that they used to live. And also with that comes competition for resources. Also with that and land use, they kind of combine to see drought. I live in California, so I know all about drought. And that could just be seen as changing climate. Oh, well, it's climate change, but also it's land use, right? Because we have just not used our waterways, right? Here what I see is we just pave the rivers. And so instead of letting that water go into the soil, go into places it needs to go, it just sits there. And that's why we have less water than we would have. And we also have less space just because with development, we are taking up more space. Animals are tending to come into those spaces that we don't really expect them to go, but also where else would they go? So a competition for resources like space, water, and food can lead to conflict. Livestock and crop management, a big one that you may have heard of is wolves, just because predators like that are really notorious for wanting to eat sheep or other things that, of course, is the livelihood of a person and can be detrimental to their income and their well-being as well. So that's why we have a lot of wildlife-human conflict there. So just the way that we are spreading and the way that we manage, and also pets. I once went to a coyote wildlife killing hearing just to hear how there were these two different sides. There are people who are worried for their pet getting eaten by a coyote, and then there are people who just say, well, just keep your pet inside, let's just try to find a way to manage our coyotes. So we have issues like that as well, where we are just trying to protect our loved ones like our pets. And, oh, I forgot to say, pets also can be predators, right? We have cats who also eat wildlife or just kill them for fun because that's their instinct. So also that's another example of wildlife-human conflict. So there are a few themes in these scenarios. We are just living closer and closer together to other species, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but it is just something we need to consider. Then those species are having habitat loss. So going back to if we cut down trees or if we just get rid of water from one area, well, all the animals that used to live there, if they can move, they will try to move somewhere. And that means they may try to move closer to us. Also property damage. If you see livestock as property, that could be one. Also just animals who are trying to rummage through trash like raccoons or do other things. So they may just they don't know the concept of property or what money is. So of course, if something is damaged, that's on us to pay and repair it. And also just environmental conditions. We have these changing conditions with just these global issues like climate change and biodiversity loss. And we'll get into what biodiversity is in a bit. So just these changing conditions is leading to more conflict in some areas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be this way. So what are the impacts? Like I mentioned before, we need to look at the impacts on not just humans, but other species as well. And I already touched on it with the property damage. We have loss of currency in some areas, especially if there are, for example, deer who come into yards to eat your garden. Well, it could be annoying if you constantly have to replace your vegetables or something. That can be a hole in your wallet. So that's loss of currency. Loss of livelihood. If you depend on that garden to make a living, then of course that can be even worse for you. And we have injured or lost pets, small dogs or even big dogs sometimes, and cats, bunnies, things like that. Also personal injuries to us. Of course, if we come into direct contact, if you're hiking or something, and even inside your house, of course, animals get inside our house and can injure us as well, or just discomfort. Maybe you don't actually get hurt, but you just don't want to live with a spider or something else in your house. That can just be really uncomfortable for you. Then we also have impacts on other species. Going back to those environmental conditions changing, they're forced to adapt. And sometimes that could be either forced to leave, forced to migrate, or forced to just learn how to live in that same area, but under different conditions. Also just loss of home if the area that they once lived in gets developed, and they can also get injuries as well. And we don't really think about animals maybe having families or having social units, but a lot of animals do. So that can also just be an injury to their peers as well. And if that happens more often than not, then we have just decreased population size, which from a conservation standpoint can be really detrimental to the whole population, to the whole species in general as well. So I liked this quote from the same website that actually had my favorite definition of wildlife-human conflict, because something really interesting with this, with just wildlife-human conflict, is that more often than not, isolated incidents result in the persecution of an entire species rather than focusing on what can be done to remedy the situation sustainably. In other words, just like sharks in this picture, we tend to paint the whole species as a certain stereotype, right? So sharks are mean, they're scary, they can be cold-blooded killers, things like that, when they're just predators. I mean, they just eat meat like a lot of us do. So we can't really paint just because one person got bit by a shark. Not that that's not scary, it's just that we shouldn't paint all species, all sharks in a bad light because of one situation. And of course, it's not just one isolated incident. Sometimes we do see patterns, certain areas where sharks, maybe they don't have other food, or a big thing that happens too with surfers is they just look like seals. And so, a shark is going to try to eat what it knows to eat. So things like that, where we just have situations that, if you look at it from a different perspective, if you look at it from a shark's perspective, maybe we would see that, okay, there are different situations, different solutions for the situation, and we just need to look at it in that area, in that context. So solutions in sharks that are here near me in California are going to be different for the kind of sharks that you may see in Massachusetts. And that's totally fine, as long as we look at it, like I said, with that context. Then we can actually remedy the situation, as this quote says, sustainably. So we do have some short-term responses that don't always actually lead to solutions, but these are changing. So this is more of just from the past, and somewhat until now, we have started to see these responses, but I will let you know about what is starting to change according to wildlife-human conflict. So a lot of the times, going back to that persecution, we really just kill the animals that, oh, I think that's the animal that killed my dog, so I'm going to shoot that wolf, something like that. So we really just tend to kill the animals, either individuals or the whole pack, the whole family, sometimes as well. Also sometimes, which this is actually the funniest response to me, is we just say, oh, well, if we build a house there, if we build a mall there, then the animals will stop coming, which I just think is funny because if we don't know by now, animals will tend to come anyways, because like I said, they need to go somewhere. Another thing that we tend to do is just guard property. This can be seen a lot in livestock areas, in areas where we just have farms that it's just easiest to put someone there, put a human there, and make sure that they keep on watch, which can actually be really beneficial, but of course that can get tiring for a person. We also tend to just instill fear. That could be as simple as a scarecrow, or that can be as intense as really yelling, making loud noises, things like that, just to scare the animals away. And we also introduce deterrence, which can be not just humans going out and yelling, but also it can be an object that you use, such as there are places in Botswana now where there are livestock areas and even crop areas. If they don't want the elephants to come and get other crops, which is very understandable, we don't want them to lose their livelihood. What they have found is if they put chili paste in some of the crops, the elephants smell that and run away. They don't like chili paste. Just the smell of it is really bad for them. And so that could be an example of a deterrent that can actually be really beneficial. But of course, that's short term because you have to keep putting that paste every time you have your crops out there. So not all of these are necessarily detrimental to the wildlife or to the human. They're just more short term. Then we have long-term solutions where we can look ahead and not just at the actual situation at hand. So if we look ahead, we think that buffer zones are something that can be really beneficial for both parties involved, wildlife and humans. And this can just be as simple as if you build a mall or something, then also allow for places around to have trees, to have some ecosystem, some plants, just where the animals can go. That way they don't automatically go into the mall and automatically get in contact with us. Then we have wildlife corridors. This is becoming really famous now, actually. And it's just connecting parks or different protected areas to one another by building bridges or tunnels, because animals quickly learn how to use these. And so just the same way that we would use a bridge over a highway or under a highway, like using a tunnel, then that's beneficial for them because they can get from one area to another without interacting with us, without, getting in contact with our cars. That can be detrimental for us and them. Then we also just have what we're doing right now, ecosystem education, just learning about how these species interact, just learning about how ecosystems work, how biodiversity works. We can just understand more and appreciate more what nature has to offer and the fact that we are part of nature. Also, knowledge of other species' behavior. Of course, in Florida, where they have alligators, it's not going to be the same. We're here in California, where I do not have alligators. We're not going to have the same solutions. So just knowing what animals are in your area and how they interact. For example, here we have mountain lions. I'm not necessarily scared of mountain lions because I know they're shy, but I also know what to do if I ever encounter one. So just knowing things like that can have you prepared for when you do come in contact with wildlife, if you ever do. And keeping your distance. Animals don't really want to interact with us a lot of the times. So as long as we keep our distance, we'll be fine and they should be fine. And region-based knowledge, not only knowing the species in your area and their behavior, but also what kind of landscapes you have, because it could be very, very different from a desert to a grassland to a forest, how you interact with that, what you wear, things like that, just to make sure you're protected. And also what we've been seeing a lot more of is nature-based cities. There is a slide in this presentation that if we get to it, I will show you the video. And it's in Singapore where they have cleaned up the waterways. And because of that, river otters have come back into the city. And it's great to see that the river otters are back, but then it's also just addressing, okay, if the river otters are back, how do we humans in this city interact with them and make sure that they thrive, but also that we thrive? And they've actually have a great example of this. They make sure they put up signs everywhere, where the river otters cross the road to make sure that the people know. Just simple things like that can really make a difference for both the humans and the other species to make sure that we all are safe and that we continue to live our lives, even though we're right next to each other. So nature-based cities really leads me to this idea of coexistence, kind of another philosophy. Unlike One Health and One Welfare that are more models, this is more just philosophy and a mindset perspective, if you will, an idea that if we live with other species in harmony and in peace, everything will be good in the world. That's kind of the first definition that comes to mind. But again, I like a second definition better, because this idea of peace and harmony may make it seem like a utopia, like, oh, one day we just never will have problems in the world. And that can be really hard to achieve, maybe even impossible, I'm not sure, but that's not necessarily the idea. And this is why I like the second definition better, that even when there is conflict, it's kept to a point where it's tolerable. It's to make sure that we can actually address it with these solutions. And it's not to the extent where we feel overwhelmed because we have the solutions, then we can actually make sure that we can, appreciate the beauty of going out and whale watching, going out and doing these things that we like to do while making sure that these species are also safe and thriving. So this is a slide that I said I'll get to if we can, just because I know there's a lot to get through today. And there's also this example of coexistence. I mentioned the elephants that don't like chili paste. Even a step further is they've done these experiments where elephants don't like the sounds of bees. They just do not like the bees. They don't want to get stung. And they have found that even if you put a speaker somewhere with the bee noise, the bees buzzing, even though the bees aren't present, the elephants hear that and they run away. So they've used this experiment to actually protect farmers and say, if you just create a beehive, if you also host beehives and get into beekeeping on top of your farming, it's a win-win situation, because you actually, you make more living, you make honey as well. And so you can make a living off of that. And you make sure that the elephants stay away from your other crops. And so what they do now is they just line beehives in front of their crops. And that, like I said, is a win-win situation for everyone, because the humans protect their crops. They even get more living out of it, more livelihood. And the elephants, they will just go look for food somewhere else. So that's another example of coexistence and just the creative solutions that we can use once we know of the behavior of other species. So with that said, soon we'll get into solutions, but I did want to just give a pause, see if we have questions or any comments. Yeah, anything anyone wants to say?
Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question if you have one. No? Okay, Tania, I think you can go.
Awesome. I'll take that as I'm explaining this very well, so I'm glad. So yes, like I promised, we will talk about solutions. We kind of already touched on it with coexistence and just this idea of those creative solutions that are a win-win for everyone. But more specifically, how do we preserve biodiversity, really the pulse of life, and this idea that we can be diverse. We can, have humans, have other species, have different kinds of humans, different kinds of species, all in one area. And everything just aligns in this ecosystem, as we see here, underwater, just in any really environment. So first of all, what is biodiversity? Just to backtrack. And like I said, it's kind of the pulse of life. It really just is life on Earth, just the most simplest way said, because biodiversity is more of it changes. It's not something that you see only in the forest or only in the ocean. It's something that we can see anywhere, even cities, like those nature-based cities. And it includes us as well, right? We are alive, we are on Earth, so it includes us. And this is the foundation of ecosystems. This is what makes sure that ecosystems are thriving, that they're resilient, that they're functioning, and that they're balanced. And when we have functioning resilient ecosystems, we're more able to address things like climate change, address things that really impact all of us. And the only way that we have biodiversity is if we have species and genetic diversity. So not only do we need a bunch of species in one area, not only do we need the fungi in the soil, do we need the insects, do we need the birds eating the insects, do we need the wildcats eating the birds, things like that. Not only do we need that whole food chain, that whole cycle, but we also need each species to have a lot of genetic diversity, because if one population of birds per se is too small and they don't have a lot of genetic diversity, they're just more likely to get sick. And that goes back to, if animals get sick, then we're likely to get sick. And it goes back to that whole cycle. So biodiversity really prevents that from happening in the first place. So the importance of ecosystems. When I think of ecosystems, I tend to think of this, just this idea of all the children books that we used to have, maybe of, you know, how we used to look at animals and just forests and Amazon and anything else that kind of gives you this idea. But of course, we know that this isn't the only type of ecosystem. Ecosystem can, like I said, even be found in cities. It could be found on your porch. It could be found anywhere where there is just a variety of life. And so ecosystems are really important, all of them, not just this one, but of course, all those smaller ones as well, because they provide so many things for not just us, but other species as well. They provide fresh water, pollination, soil fertility, stability that lets us grow our food, and food and medicine. And all of those were said by the Conservation International Organization, but I added shelter because I think that's very important as well, that ecosystems provide. And that could look like birds that, like woodpeckers that use trees, or it can be just us building something out of natural resources. That's also shelter. And ecosystems and biodiversity really go hand in hand. It's hard, if not impossible, to have one without the other, because in ecosystems, like in this picture, we see biodiversity. But also, if we did not see biodiversity, we really had this ecosystem in the first place. So they really just go hand in hand, because it's hard to have one without the other. And they rely on each other to really thrive and continue functioning. So what are the solutions to protect these ecosystems and to really create a world where they can thrive more than they are right now? One is to stop pollution. And when we think of pollution, we may think of mostly air pollution, but there are so many others that sometimes don't always affect us. So we have air pollution, water pollution, that's just chemicals getting into our water, such as runoff, such as pesticides. Going back to what Janet was saying, pesticides can go into our water if a storm comes and it just runs off into our waterways, our rivers, our oceans. Then we have soil pollution, again with pesticides. We don't want those chemicals in there. We have noise as well, which may not feel like really pollution for us because we may be more adapted to noise, but it can be a pollution for, such as a whale that needs to make a call 1,000 miles away in an ocean. And if there's ship noise, if there's other things in the water, that can be pollution for them because it prevents them from making those calls. We also have thermal pollution, just heat, and how different areas have more heat than others, such as cities, whereas places like the Amazon may not have as much. Then we have chemical as well, go back to pesticides, even more harsher chemicals, like industrial ones. And then we have light pollution, which again, may not seem as harmful to humans, but it can be harmful to other animals like turtles who are relying on moonlight to get to the ocean once they're born. And if there is a lot of light in the city right next to them, they may start going into the city actually where they're not supposed to go, and that could be harmful for them. Then we have radioactive pollution, which, you know, it could just be harder to get rid of because it really needs to be dealt with delicately. And then we have plastic pollution as well, which can be harmful for both humans and wildlife. So that's one thing, just essentially stop the things that are damaging the ecosystems we have now. But on the other side, rather than just preventing that, it's also just preserving what we still have. And so this is a bit of a blurry graphic, sorry about that, but I did really like it because it shows a little bit about what you kind of see in an ecosystem. You see the water, you see the soil, you see the different animals. So you see a smaller animal, a squirrel, and then you see a larger animal. I think this is a wolf or coyote, I'm not even really sure, but something that would essentially eat a squirrel, and how that all comes together with the tree, with the sun, how all these different processes are moving oxygen, carbon, all these different earth elements in a cycle. And because of that, it stays intact because all these energy, all these elements are continuing to stay in that area as they go down into the ground, go up the plant, go up into the sun, into the clouds, then back down into the ground. Then we make sure that this continues to stay thriving. So to preserve things like this, we do need to do some also we need to stop other activities, not just the pollution, but also things like deforestation. Because if we get rid of that tree in the picture, then this cycle stops to be what it is now. Also, just allowing plants to grow back before harvesting, because deforestation can feel like, oh, so we can't use plants at all. We can't, we're just supposed to just let trees live. And what are we supposed to use? What are we supposed to eat or anything now? And the idea isn't to just leave nature be and us go into this other place where we don't touch nature. The idea is just to be mindful of nature's processes so that we can allow plants and animals to at least get to a certain stage before we do eat them or use them in another way. And so we can still keep using plants and other animals. It's just about when and what life stage, and making sure which ones we pick out before we do, to make sure that they actually have, if there's only one squirrel left in that ecosystem, then maybe we shouldn't be eating the squirrel. But if there are plenty, then we can. And preserving soil health, making sure that these little decomposers right there are actually thriving, that they don't have those chemicals that are harming them. And just considering all these processes, how they come together, we can make sure that we preserve them and that we don't not only not harm them, but that we can learn from them as well, because there's so much to learn in this picture if we just observed and listened to all the different species that are in this picture. Then we have wildlife conservation, and the way we can conserve wildlife, it really isn't just solutions in the sense that there isn't just restoring wildlife populations, because if you have all this wildlife but you don't have habitat, then you really aren't really helping wildlife. So just by preserving intact ecosystems, we are preserving these habitats that these wild animals need. And so on top of that, it's just making sure that when there's habitat, we also have the animals in there, because like we saw in that last picture, we do need that squirrel and that coyote looking thing to preserve that ecosystem. So wildlife conservation, it's also about habitat and animal. So when it comes to the animals themselves, it's making sure that they're in that ecosystem and they're not taken out. So that means that we don't have trade. We don't have, that could be seen as pet trade or for parts as well. Elephants are really famous for their ivory. So just making sure that we don't prioritize those things, and we make sure that the animals are actually in the places where they should be, where they are best suited for. Also introduce species. You can also call them invasive or alien species. I personally prefer introduced species because sometimes, just in this changing world, there are animals that who aren't native to an area per se are thriving and are actually helping other animals in the area. One example of this is Bio4Climate did a campaign last year with Kachana Station, which is just this holistic management area in Australia. It's a bit far, but it's really cool because in that area, they have a wild donkey herd, and donkeys are not native to Australia. They were brought over when Europeans came over. But what we're seeing, what research is showing, is that the donkeys dig wells, and the way that they graze grass is actually really beneficial for the ecosystem there. And when they dig wells, although they're drinking water from there, other animals do as well. The birds in the area, the wildcats in the area. I think there's only one wildcat actually. Australia doesn't have too many wildcats. But essentially other animals are using those wells. And so it just goes to show that not every species is automatically invasive or alien per se. And just because our planet is changing, it already has changed so much, we don't necessarily have to go back to a certain area of how it used to be before. We can see how species where they are now can benefit the ecosystems they are in now, even if they weren't there before. So that's one example of conservation that, although the donkeys may not necessarily quote unquote belong there, if we see that they are benefiting the area, then maybe it is cool to just see if, okay, we see that they are filling the void that maybe we created. Let's see if we can work with them now. And so that also combines just different things like climate change, things are changing, and pollution, things have already changed, but we can work with animals to make sure that they stay in those habitats, and we can work with their habitats to make sure they are thriving. Then we have lands and waterways. And so just restoring things that look like this. I know it looks so beautiful. We want to restore and have more places like this. But of course, again, it doesn't have to only look like this. We can have waterways and lands in cities. We can have them in places where it may not actually look like this picturesque scene, but it can still be something that we can all benefit from. And we can do that by having ecosystem restoration, just restoring what was once there as much as we can with native plants. I know you're all having a native plant event later this month. That's amazing. So things like that. Regenerative practices as well, making sure that we have practices that aren't like those industrial food systems, but we have those animals outside and we're making sure that they're benefiting the soil, and then that soil will benefit us. And that combines agriculture and conservation. We can have places where not only do we only grow food, but we also provide space for wildlife. We also provide space for pollinators, like that example of the elephants and how they are growing food, but they're also benefiting the local bees in the area as well. And we just need to clean up toxins so we can have those nature-based cities. So we can have places like Singapore that the animals are coming back and they are liking it. And our very last solution, last but not least, is empowering local communities, because what you all do in Cambridge is going to be very specific to Cambridge, to the environment in Cambridge, to the people in Cambridge, to the animals in Cambridge, which is going to be different from me, from places in LA with our animals and our environment and culture. And that's how it should be. We should be thinking globally, but acting locally, because every project is going to look different. Every community will have different needs. What you all need will be different from what me and my community here need. And that's fine, as long as we all find solutions that work for us and the animals in that area and the biodiversity in that area, then we can each find long-term sustainable solutions. And we can also provide support. So whenever, my staff members and my fellow staff members from Bioflow Climate in Cambridge need support, I can sign a petition. Small things like that really do make a difference. Or even just providing other moral support as well. So the last quote I'll leave you all with is from the David Suzuki Foundation. It is, "We are interconnected with nature and with each other. What we do to the planet and its living creatures, we do to ourselves." So all of this to say, ego versus echo, is right now we are looking at it in the way that we're on top. So because humans are on top, what we do doesn't affect other species, or it shouldn't matter as much. But when we look at echo, we see that no, it's not that way actually. Nature works in the sense that we are part of nature. So what we do to other species comes back to us. And because of that, why don't we just make sure that we put out more positivity, more nurturing, more well-being, because that's what will come back to us as well. And that's all I have for you today, but thank you so much for having me.